The Alpha froze at the medical bay door because the human he came to punish had 3 of his cubs asleep on his chest. That is the part nobody believes when I tell the story, because most species prefer their miracles loud, bright, and professionally announced. This one was quiet. It smelled like thermal blankets, storm dust, antiseptic foam, and one exhausted Earth-born caretaker who had not moved in nearly 2 hours because the smallest cub had finally stopped shaking. My name is Vera Sol, and before that night on Outpost Haven 9, I thought humans were useful in emergencies but dangerously soft around predators. They apologized to vending machines. They named repair drones. They saw teeth and said things like "per baby," which is not a survival strategy on most civilized worlds. Then Ethan Brooks opened the door with one hand, placed one finger against his lips, and told the most feared Varkathi pack in the Outer Rim, "Quiet." They finally fell asleep. Nobody moved. Not the station guards behind me. Not the medics hiding beside the supply wall. Not the pack crowding the corridor in a line of fur, claws, and rage barely held together by discipline. At their front stood Koresh, the Alpha, nearly 8 feet tall at the shoulder when hunched, black mane bristling, gold eyes fixed on the human with the terrible focus of a parent who had run out of patience, and nearly run out of hope. 10 seconds earlier, I was certain the door would open to disaster. The Varkathi had arrived for vengeance. Their 3 cubs had vanished during the plasma storm beyond the East Ridge, and every trail, every scent trace, every panicked security ping had pointed toward the human medical bay. In their law, cubs are not property. They are the future of the pack, the living promise that tomorrow has teeth. To touch them without permission is an insult. To frighten them is a crime. To take them is something even diplomats do not put into polite words. So when Koresh reached the door, nobody expected negotiation. We expected roaring. We expected the station to learn exactly why Varkathi warning signs are printed in 12 languages and still mostly ignored by fools. Instead, the door slid open to warm dim light, and there was Ethan Brooks lying on a narrow medical cot, boots still on, jacket half-zipped, one arm trapped under a pile of thermal blankets. The cubs were there. All 3. Safe. Breathing softly. One curled against his side. One tucked under his chin with a tiny paw gripping his shirt. The smallest one lay directly over his heart, rising and falling with the slow rhythm of his breathing. Ethan looked tired enough to fall asleep standing up, except he was not standing. He was pinned beneath the most precious creatures in the corridor, and somehow he looked less afraid of the pack than of waking them. Koresh stared. The whole pack stared. Ethan glanced down at the cub on his chest, then back at the Alpha, and whispered, "Please do not make me start over. The little one just got warm." That was when the vengeance stopped at the doorway. 10 minutes earlier, Outpost Haven 9 was screaming through every alarm it owned. Red lights rolled along the corridor walls. Emergency shutters slammed over the observation windows. The East Ridge storm shields were still crackling from the plasma front outside, and the whole station smelled like hot dust, ozone, and panic pretending to be procedure. I was in the central corridor with 2 medics, 4 guards, and 1 administrator who kept repeating, "This is a misunderstanding," in the hopeless tone of someone who had never survived one. The Varkathi pack was coming through the outer gate. Not walking. Advancing. There is a difference. A walking predator is travel. An advancing predator is a decision. Security cameras showed them moving through the storm wash in a dark line, shoulders low, eyes bright against the dust. At the front was Koresh, the Alpha, head lowered into the wind, mane snapping behind him, every step measured and furious. Behind him came the rest of the pack, parents, siblings, guards, all pulled by the same terrible purpose. Their cubs were missing. 3 of them. The little ones had vanished near the East Ridge playground enclosure when the storm warning changed too late, and the automated shelter doors jammed halfway open. By the time station security reached the enclosure, there were only tiny tracks in the dust, scattered blanket scraps, and 1 broken signal tag still blinking under a bench. Then the internal sensors picked up movement near the human medical bay. 3 small heat signatures. 1 adult human. That was all it took. Information travels fast during fear, and it rarely arrives clean. Within 2 minutes, half the station believed Ethan Brooks had taken the cubs. Within 5, the Varkathi believed it too. Ethan, of all people. The human caretaker who fixed scraped knees with dinosaur bandages because he said children liked dinosaurs. The man who kept spare snacks in every cargo pocket. The Earth-born field medic who once spent an entire shift helping a lost hatchling find its sleep pod while apologizing to every wall panel he bumped into. He was not built like a warrior. He was 5 feet 11 inches, maybe 170 pounds, with tired blue eyes, pale skin, and the kind of calm face that made danger seem slightly embarrassed for interrupting him. But calm does not look like innocence to a terrified pack. Not when cubs are missing. Not when a storm is howling. Not when every scent trail points to a closed medical door. Commander Rul sent 3 messages ordering Ethan to evacuate. He answered the first one with, "Not yet." The second with, "Keep the hall quiet." The third with, "Do not open this door fast." That was when the administrator started sweating through his collar. "He has lost his mind," one guard whispered. I almost agreed. Because on every world I knew, when a pack like that came for you, you ran, hid, negotiated, or prayed in whatever order your species preferred. Humans, apparently, had a 5th option. Stay exactly where the babies are sleeping. The missing cubs had not been taken. They had chosen the only warm room left on the east side of the station. That fact sounds simple now, but in the middle of alarms, storm static, and a predator pack marching through the outer gate, simple facts have to fight for survival. The East Ridge playground enclosure had been built for visiting younglings from 12 species, which meant it was safe in the way committee designed things are safe, carefully labeled, over-tested, and completely unprepared for 3 Varkathi cubs who thought warning sirens were a game. The plasma storm came over the ridge faster than forecast, turning the sky outside the dome a bright electric violet. The automated shelter doors began closing. One jammed. A sensor tag failed. The cubs panicked, ran low under the safety rails, and followed the heat vents through a maintenance crawlspace no adult Varkathi could have fit through even with determination and a medical waiver. Security later found the trail. Tiny paw prints in orange dust. Claw marks on a vent panel. A torn strip of thermal blanket caught on a pipe. At the time, all anyone knew was that 3 cubs had disappeared and a human had stopped answering properly. Ethan Brooks had been in the medical bay inventory room when the first cub came out of the lower vent, shivering so hard the supply scanner flagged it as equipment vibration. The second tumbled after her, dragging the smallest by the scruff of his collar harness. Ethan told me later he did not think. He just moved slowly, shut off the loud alarm speaker inside the room, and sat down on the floor so he would not look like a towering stranger. That was such a human detail. A Varkathi adult would have barked commands. A station medic would have called containment. Ethan made himself smaller. The cubs were coated in storm dust, too cold, too scared, and furious about both conditions. The largest one hissed at him. The middle one tried to drag the smallest behind a cabinet. The smallest made no sound at all, which Ethan said worried him most. So he did what humans apparently do when the universe throws frightened children into their room. He warmed blankets. He opened a ration pack that smelled vaguely like roasted chicken. He talked nonsense in a low voice. Not instructions. Not negotiation. Just sound. "You are okay. Bad night, huh? Yeah, I get it. Storms are loud. We are inside now." The cubs did not understand the words, but they understood the rhythm. Earth mammals have that trick, I learned. They turn their own heartbeat into a metronome and invite fear to slow down. By the time the station located their heat signatures, Ethan was on the cot because the smallest cub had climbed onto his chest and refused to move. The other 2 followed because cub logic is simple and absolute. If the smallest found the safe place, take it before someone else does. Ethan could have stood up. He could have handed them to security and explained everything. Instead, He looked down at three exhausted little predators finally breathing evenly and decided the entire station could wait. That was the misunderstanding. Not that the human had taken them. That the human thought sleep was more urgent than politics. The pack did not ask questions because packs with missing cubs do not believe questions arrive fast enough. Koresh reached the inner corridor 3 minutes after the station gates opened, and every creature on Haven 9 learned what disciplined fury sounded like when it moved on 4 sets of padded feet. The Varkathi did not roar the whole way. That would have been easier. Noise gives fear somewhere to go. They advanced in near silence, claws clicking against the metal floor, shoulders rolling under storm-dark fur, their breath steaming in the cold air left by the emergency climate drop. Behind them, the outer gate sealed with a heavy boom, and the administrator beside me whispered, "Maybe we can still explain." Nobody answered him. Explanation had already lost the race. Commander Rul placed 6 guards across the medical corridor, not because he thought they could stop the pack, but because uniforms are what stations use when they do not know what else to put between disaster and a closed door. Koresh stopped 10 feet from them. He did not lower his head. He did not bare his teeth. He simply looked at the guards, and one by one they remembered urgent duties along the walls. I could not blame them. The Alpha carried grief like gravity. It bent the corridor around him. "Where are they?" he asked. His translator turned the words into Galactic Standard, but it could not soften the sound underneath. Commander Rul raised both hands, palms outward. "Alpha Koresh, your cubs are alive. Their heat signatures are inside the medical bay. We are attempting to confirm their condition." Koresh's gold eyes moved to the sealed door. "Open it. We need to proceed carefully," Rul said. "The human caretaker has requested quiet." That was the wrong sentence. Every Varkathi head turned toward him. Even I felt my stomach drop. To a parent who has crossed a plasma storm for missing cubs, saying the human requested anything sounded almost professionally foolish. Koresh stepped closer. The guards stepped farther aside with the smooth teamwork of people discovering humility. "The human does not request," Koresh said. "The human answers." Inside the room, the communication panel blinked. Ethan's voice came through low and tired. "Commander, please do not let them rush the door." Rul swallowed. "Caretaker Brooks, the Alpha is here." "I figured," Ethan said. Hard to miss the hallway getting quieter. That was such a human thing to say that my fear briefly lost balance. Koresh leaned toward the panel. "Human! Bring out my cubs!" There was a pause. Not defiance. Not fear. Just the pause of someone choosing the least terrible words. "I cannot do that right now," Ethan said. The corridor temperature seemed to drop. Corridors do not have expressions, but if they did, this one would have started making end-of-life arrangements. Koresh's voice lowered. "You cannot?" Ethan answered softly. "The smallest one is asleep on my chest. If I move too fast, he starts shaking again. Give me 30 seconds to open the door slowly, and do not make loud noises when you see them." No one breathed. The Alpha stared at the panel, rage and confusion colliding behind his eyes. Then, with visible effort, he gave one command to the pack without looking back. Still. The entire Varkathi line froze. Ethan had not won. Not yet. But somehow, from behind a sealed medical door, the human had made vengeance wait. The medical bay door opened so slowly that every inch felt like a negotiation with disaster. First came the warm, dim light from inside, softer than the emergency red flooding the corridor. Then came the smell. Varkathi's senses are famous across the outer rim, and even those of us with weaker biology felt the pack react before we understood why. Storm dust. Antiseptic foam. Heated blankets. Human sweat. Cub fur. No sharp scent of fear. No scent of pursuit. No scent of a predator guarding a prize. Just exhaustion, cold weather, and someone trying very hard not to wake sleeping children. Ethan Brooks appeared in the gap with one hand on the door control and one finger pressed against his lips. He looked ridiculous. That was my first thought, and I am ashamed of it now. His hair was flattened on one side. His pale face looked tired. His jacket had little claw snags near the zipper. A strip of medical tape was stuck to his sleeve for no obvious reason. He was not heroic in any traditional sense. He looked like a man who had survived a long babysitting shift and needed coffee strong enough to qualify as a controlled substance. But behind him, on the narrow cot, were the 3 missing cubs, bundled in thermal blankets and breathing in a slow, shared rhythm. The smallest was still on his chest because Ethan had not fully stood. He was half leaning, half trapped, one shoulder braced against the cot, moving only as much as the door required. The cub's tiny paw was hooked in the fabric of his shirt, not with fear, but with ownership. Koresh saw it, and stopped so suddenly that the pack behind him compressed in silence. Ethan whispered. I said quiet. Commander Ruel looked like he wanted to apologize to the entire concept of authority. Koresh did not answer. His gold eyes moved from the smallest cub to the middle one curled against Ethan's side, then to the largest asleep with her nose tucked under a blanket corner. She made a small sound in her sleep, and 20 Varkathi adults froze like statues built for a temple. Ethan looked at the alpha, and there was no challenge in him. That made it worse somehow. He was not trying to dominate the corridor. He was not proving courage. He was simply enforcing NAP rules against the most dangerous audience imaginable. They came in through the heat vent, he whispered. Cold, scared, full of dust. I got them warm. That is all. Koresh took one step into the room. Every guard tensed. Ethan lifted his hand slightly, palm down, the universal gesture for slow. I expected the alpha to ignore it. He did not. He lowered his foot. Carefully, placing it without sound. That was the first impossible thing. The second was the smallest cub opening one sleepy eye, seeing Koresh, and then pressing his face deeper into Ethan's shirt instead of climbing down. The entire pack watched it happen. No speech could have defended the human better. No evidence file. No security footage. No diplomatic statement. The cub had seen his alpha and chosen not to leave the warm heartbeat yet. Ethan glanced down and sighed through his nose. Yeah, he whispered. He has been doing that. Koresh's mane settled by a fraction. His voice, when it came, was no longer thunder. It was something older and quieter. Why did you not bring them out? Ethan looked at the 3 sleeping shapes and answered like the question was simple. Because they were finally safe enough to sleep. Koresh did not step closer right away. That was how I knew the truth had reached him. A frightened parent rushes. An angry alpha commands. But a leader who has just discovered that his rage arrived late stands still and lets his senses do the work. His nose lowered first, not toward Ethan's face, but toward the blankets, the cubs, the cot, the scattered medical supplies, and the faint line of storm dust Ethan had tracked across the floor when he carried them in. The room became so quiet I could hear the climate vent humming above us. Ethan stayed exactly where he was, half reclined beneath the sleeping cubs, one arm resting along the cot rail, the other trapped under the smallest bundle of fur and blanket. He looked uncomfortable. Not afraid. Just deeply, practically uncomfortable, the way humans look when their leg has fallen asleep but they refuse to move because a cat is on them. Koresh breathed in again. His gold eyes shifted. I watched the story assemble itself in his mind through scent alone. The storm outside. The cold on the cub's fur. The antiseptic foam Ethan had used on tiny scrapes. The emergency heat packs tucked beneath the blankets. The ration crumbs near the pillow. The absence of restraint straps. The absence of panic. The absence of anything that belonged to a captor. Ethan whispered, I know how this looked. Koresh's gaze snapped to him. Ethan immediately lowered his voice further. Sorry. Quiet. One of the older Varkathi behind him made a sound that might have been disbelief. The human had just corrected himself for speaking too loudly during his own possible trial. Koresh leaned closer to the smallest cub. The cub's ear twitched. Ethan stopped breathing for a second. So did half the corridor. The cub did not wake. Instead, he made a tiny sigh and pressed his palm more firmly against Ethan's shirt. Koresh saw that. Everyone saw that. Something in the alpha's posture changed. Not softened. That is the wrong word. Koresh did not become less dangerous. He became more precise. His anger lost its target, and had nowhere honorable to land. You warmed them with your body, he said. Ethan glanced down like the fact had only just become interesting. Blankets helped. You did not call for handlers. They were scared of the alarm. You did not remove them from you. Ethan gave the smallest possible shrug, which was impressive under 3 sleeping cubs. They cried when I tried. The translator rendered the word cried too cleanly, too clinically, but the pack understood the meaning underneath it. The middle cub shifted in sleep, nose wrinkling, and Ethan instantly froze again. Koresh watched the reaction. That was the moment, I think. Not the blankets. Not the warmth. Not even the cubs sleeping. It was the way Ethan made himself still before anyone had to tell him. The way he treated their rest like law. On Varkathi worlds, the oldest pack rule is simple. The one who guards sleeping cubs stands above challenge until the cubs wake. It is not mercy. It is structure. It is survival. Ethan Brooks did not know that rule. He had followed it anyway. Koresh slowly lowered his head until his mane brushed the floor. Not a bow. Not surrender. A scent mark of acknowledgement, old and formal enough that every Varkathi behind him straightened in shock. Ethan looked at me, confused and helpless. I mouthed, "Do not move." He whispered back. Was not planning to. The smallest cub woke first, because the universe has a talent for choosing the most dangerous possible witness. His eyes opened as thin gold slits, unfocused at first, then sharp enough to find Koresh standing at the foot of the cot. Every adult in the room stopped breathing again. The cub was tiny by Varkathi standards, barely the size of a large earth dog, though I would never have said that aloud in front of the pack. His ears were too big for his head, his paws too wide for his body, and his fur still held little sparks of storm dust that glowed faintly under the medical lights. He looked at the alpha. The alpha looked back. For one perfect second, the entire crisis balanced on that small face. Then the cub yawned, showed a mouthful of little teeth, and tucked himself deeper against Ethan Brooks's chest. The sound that moved through the pack was not anger. It was shock, pure and helpless. Koresh stared as if a law of nature had politely stepped aside without permission. Ethan looked down, then up at the alpha, then back down again. He has been doing that, he whispered. I think the heartbeat helps. Koresh's mane lifted slightly. Your heartbeat? Ethan nodded as much as he could without disturbing the cub. Yeah. My mom used to say babies like steady sounds. Heartbeats, washing machines, old truck engines. I figured small frightened people are small frightened people. The translator handled the sentence badly. It did not know what to do with washing machines or old truck engines. But the meaning survived. Ethan had not seen monsters. He had not seen enemy young. He had seen cold children and done what his species had been doing since caves, storms, and firelight. Warm them. Hold still. Keep watch. The middle cub stirred next, one ear flicking toward Koresh's scent. She lifted her head, blinked sleepily at the pack, then pressed one paw against Ethan's jacket as if making sure he was still there. The largest cub did not wake at all. She only sighed and rolled 1 inch closer to the heat pack tucked beneath the blanket. Koresh lowered his head toward them, close enough that his breath ruffled the blanket edge. Ethan's hand moved without thinking, not to block him, not to challenge him, but to shield the smallest cub from the sudden draft. He realized what he had done a second later and froze. The corridor did too. Protecting a cub from its own alpha was either the bravest mistake I had ever seen or the most human one. Koresh did not punish the gesture. He studied it. Then he looked at Ethan's hand, pale, scratched by vent dust, trembling slightly from exhaustion, and the last piece of vengeance left his eyes. You guarded them from me, he said. Ethan swallowed. No. From the noise. That answer did something to the pack. I felt it move backward through them, adult to adult, breath to breath. They had come ready to confront a thief. They found a caretaker so committed to keeping their cubs calm that he had accidentally corrected an alpha. Koresh turned his head toward the pack and gave one low command. Voices down. Every Varkathi in the corridor lowered their breathing, their posture, even the scrape of their claws. The guards looked at each other, stunned. Commander Rul looked like he was watching a treaty write itself. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second, relieved. The smallest cub heard the quiet deepen, gave a sleepy little chirp, and finally settled fully against the human's chest again. Koresh stood beside the cot, no longer blocking the door from Ethan. Blocking it for him. Koresh did not sit. Alphas do not sit in doorways when danger might still be deciding whether to come back. He stood beside the cot with his body angled toward the corridor, broad shoulders filling the medical bay entrance, gold eyes watching every movement beyond the room. That was the strange part. 10 minutes earlier, every guard on Haven 9 had been terrified he would force his way in. Now nobody could get past him without permission, and somehow the safest place on the station was behind the creature we had all feared most. The pack understood before the rest of us did. One by one, the Varkathi stepped back from the doorway, not retreating, not surrendering, simply making space around a sleeping place. Their claws lifted carefully from the metal floor. Their breathing slowed. Even the younger guards lowered their heads and turned away from the cot, giving the cubs the privacy their own panic had almost destroyed. Commander Rul looked at me with wide eyes, silently asking if this was good. I had no idea. My training included emergency triage, evacuation procedures, and basic predator etiquette, but it did not include what to do when an Earthborn caretaker accidentally became sacred furniture. Ethan Brooks looked even more confused than I felt. He was still trapped under the cubs, his arm asleep, his neck at a bad angle, and his face caught somewhere between relief and the desperate hope that no one would ask him to move. Is he going to keep standing there? He whispered. I glanced at Koresh. I believe he is guarding you. Ethan blinked. Me? The smallest cub answered by kneading one tiny paw against his shirt in sleep. Koresh did not turn around, but his ear flicked. Not you, the alpha said quietly. The rest. Ethan absorbed that for a second, then nodded like it made perfect sense to divide the universe into sleeping cubs and everything that might disturb them. Fair enough, he whispered. The station administrator chose that moment to recover his authority, which was unfortunate for everyone. He stepped forward with a tablet clutched to his chest and said, Alpha Koresh, perhaps we should relocate the cubs to a more appropriate species-specific recovery environment. Koresh looked at him. That was all. The administrator stepped back so quickly he nearly apologized to a supply cart. Ethan closed his eyes. Please do not start a meeting in here. One of the medics made a soft choking sound that might have been laughter. Koresh's mouth did not smile, but something in his posture shifted, just enough to suggest he approved of the human's priorities. Outside the medical bay, the storm began to fade. The emergency lights dimmed from red to amber. The station's alarms finally stopped screaming and settled into low status tones. With the noise gone, we could hear the cubs breathing. 3 small rhythms. One slower human heartbeat beneath them. The pack listened. Not politely. Reverently. For Varkathi, breath is proof of protection kept. Sleep is proof of trust earned. Ethan had given them both without knowing the words for either. After several long minutes, the largest cub woke, lifted her head, saw the pack at the door, and made a sleepy sound of complaint. Not fear. Complaint. As if all these adults had interrupted a very good nap. Ethan whispered, I know, buddy. They are being weird. Half the Varkathi stared at him. Koresh finally turned his head and said, You call her buddy? Ethan looked down at the cub. I call everybody buddy until they tell me their name. The alpha considered that, then faced the corridor again. Her name is Sava. Ethan nodded solemnly. Okay. Sorry, Sava. The cub huffed once and put her head back down. That was the moment the pack fully changed. Not because they trusted humans. Not because centuries of instinct vanished in a warm room. Because the alpha had named his cub to the human, and the human had apologized to her like she was a person. Around me, the Varkathi lowered their voices further, and the corridor became a guard post instead of a battlefield. They had come to take their cubs back. Instead, they stood watch until the cubs decided they were ready to wake. The cubs woke one at a time, the way small creatures return from deep sleep when the world has finally stopped trying to scare them. Sava lifted her head first, blinked at Ethan Brooks, blinked at Koresh, then stretched so hard that one back paw escaped the blanket and tapped Ethan under the chin. He made a quiet sound that might have been pain and might have been laughter. "Good morning to you too," he whispered. The middle cub yawned next, then looked around with the sleepy confidence of someone who had missed the entire political crisis and felt no responsibility for it. The smallest one stayed tucked over Ethan's heart the longest. That felt right. He had been the coldest. He had needed the rhythm most. When he finally opened his eyes, Koresh lowered his head until their noses nearly touched. No one spoke. The cub sniffed the alpha, then turned and bumped his forehead gently against Ethan's chest before climbing down. A thank you, maybe? Or a claim. With cubs, those are often the same thing. Ethan sat up slowly, and every joint in his body seemed to file a complaint at once. He tried to hide it. The entire pack noticed anyway. Koresh stepped aside only when all three cubs were on their feet. They wobbled toward the pack, were immediately surrounded by careful noses, soft rumbles, and adult bodies trying very hard not to crowd them. Ethan watched with the dazed expression of a man who had lent someone his couch and accidentally hosted a religious ceremony. "They should be checked again in an hour," he said. "Warm fluids, quiet room, no bright lights if you can help it." Commander Rul started to repeat the instructions officially, but Koresh ignored him and listened directly to Ethan. That mattered. An alpha does not take cub care instructions from outsiders. Not unless the outsider has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Koresh stepped close to the cot. The room tightened again, but not with fear this time. With witness. He lowered his head, not to the floor, but to the level of Ethan's tired eyes. "You kept the pack's future warm," he said. Ethan looked uncomfortable with the weight of that sentence. "Very human. Give them a sacred honor, and they look like you handed them the wrong restaurant bill." "They were cold," he said. "I was warm." Koresh held his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned to the corridor and gave a command in Varkathi, low and formal. The pack shifted at once. 2 adults took position outside the medical bay. Not facing inward. Facing out. Guarding the room. Ethan looked at me. "Is that good?" I swallowed. "It means no one enters without permission." "Whose permission?" Koresh answered before I could. "Yours, until the cubs leave this station." Ethan stared at him. "That seems like a lot." The alpha's mane lifted slightly. "So was staying still." By morning, every security feed on Haven 9 had been reviewed, sealed, copied, and somehow still leaked across half the outer rim. The official report called it a resolved misunderstanding involving storm displacement and interspecies emergency care. Nobody cared about the official report. The story that spread was simpler. The Varkathi came for vengeance and found their cubs asleep on a human heartbeat. They left guards at his door. That was when I stopped thinking of humans as soft. Soft things do not hold the line while predators decide whether to trust them. Soft things do not turn a medical cot into neutral ground. Earth did not only teach humans how to survive storms, teeth, winter,